Yo, what is up? Welcome to the docket presented by Defense Diaries, and we're going to give you just facts. So we are back with one of my favorite humans of all time, and that is William Bill Dorsch, former Chicago police detective. And, you know, we've had smaller crowds for this. I'm not sure why. I'm hoping that people will start talking about what we're doing. We're not just a couple of guys talking about victim advocacy. We are going to be boots on the ground searching for additional victims of John Wayne Gacy. We're talking shovels in the ground, and I'm hoping that the community, the true crime community, will get behind this. So, you know, if it's something that you're into, if you care about victim advocacy, if you're, into the scene and you want to help, getting the word out will help, because we really want a lot of people spreading the word on this, because Bill has been working his fingers to the bone for 20 plus years investigating. And he's really no spring chicken, So Bill has made it abundantly clear to me, we've got to get this done now, which is what we're going to be doing. And what we've been doing the past few episodes with Bill is kind of giving you guys the background of what is going to be leading up to us doing lives from outside of my little studio thing here, and Bill back from his undisclosed location in Europe out in areas where we believe that we are hopefully going to find additional victims that have gone unnamed, lost their names, and we hope to give them their names back and their families closure. So that's what we're doing here. But we want to inform you on how we have gotten to this point, like what Bill has done, what I have done in order to get us to this point. And tonight we're going to be starting to dig in to Bill's actual investigation. We got you guys to how Bill had initially met Gacy with his little dinner with Gacy with his wife and his kid. And then, seeing Gacy out there with the shovel at this property that Gacy was a maintenance man at for several years when they believed that he was dormant. And, Bill then going to, I think it was the 5th district, and saying, hey, this is what I saw. And then Bill hoping that they would do their jobs. They didn't. And, then Bill realizing that no one was doing their job with respect to investigating anything that Gacy may have done during the 6 years that he operated, killing innocent people. And at that point, Bill got pissed, and, Bill forced a dig over at Miami and Elston. And we always consider that and refer to it as the sham dig, because it wasn't a dig that actually had any kind of concrete proof to the fact that it actually took place, because it was just Cook County sheriffs in that little tent, as they had escorted the 2 GPR guys out of the tent, and came out 15 minutes later. And we've explained to you that Chicago and Cook County are not in the business of wanting to find additional Gacy victims. It's not something that they're interested in doing, and we are. We don't have an agenda like the city of Chicago does, whatever that may be. I can't understand what their agenda would be in terms of not wanting to give people their names back and families closure. To me, there's no excuse for that. And Bill feels the exact same way. So that's where we're at. I just wanted to, I'm going to get off my soapbox now, but this thing should really be catching more fire than it is. So get the word out. Let people know what we're doing. I've got my stuff like Delphi, which I'm covering, and I'm boots on the ground on that. This is different. This is different. As passionate as I am about Delphi, you've got to know I'm even more passionate about this because this is important. And there's victims out there that we believe that deserve justice, that deserve their names back, and those families deserve closure. So that's what we're up to. So without further ado, I'm going to bring my man in, Bill Dorsch. What's up, Bill?
Hey, Bob. Good to see you again, sir.
Hey, what's up, man? You got a little COVID floating around?
No, it's not a COVID thing, Bob. But from the last episode, the big issue outside of the Gacy investigation was the mustache, and I didn't realize it was I knew it was big in my home because it's an issue between me and my wife, but I didn't realize it was such a big issue with your fans.
I mean, look, we love your mustache. I don't know. At least I do. That's all I can say.
Well, I said we should have a vote on it, and boy, was I blown away when I got the results. Okay,
yeah,
let me show you. I didn't realize you had this many fans, Bob, but I've got 263,019 for yes, and 263,019 for no. So that's a tie.
Wow.
But it's certified by Kamala Harris because I went through the same process as the president did and figured might as well get it right. So she signed it here and dated it, and I just got it back the other day. Okay. Well, being a tie doesn't really solve it. But because my wife and I are in Europe, we had to write in ballots. We couldn't vote like everybody else did. So I got the actual ballots from my wife and I.
Well, I'm excited to see them. I would assume that your wife would carry more weight than the average citizen. I would assume.
Yeah, she does. There's no doubt. But I voted. I got mine. I opened mine first. I thought, okay, at worst, we're going to have another tie because I know what I want. I know what she wants. Well, my vote was disqualified because of a hanging Chad. Okay.
Wow.
And so that's disqualified.
Poor guy.
A lot of people probably don't know about that. But anyway, my wife's vote was for yes for the mustache, and she had signed it.
All right.
So I can actually now get rid of this thing,
Maybe. Hey,
boy,
back.
It's uncomfortable, man. I'll tell you.
It's back. It's almost.
I feel better. I never should have done it, but sometimes you go a little crazy.
It's as thick as it already is. I mean, it seems like we were just on last week or something, and you had no mustache, and now it's miraculously back.
Yeah, well, that's 2 weeks. It's going to grow in good, I hope.
I mean, it looks great already. It looks great.
Yeah.
I mean, it's your standard look. If I were to draw a caricature of you, there's no question of it. You know what I mean? So, all right. Well, I've missed you, my friend. I'm glad we're back together. I had a little wedding down in New Orleans, so I've been down there for the past 4 days, which is always exhausting as I go pretty hard down there. I have a tendency to party pretty hard and stay up probably later than I should. So it takes me a while to recover from that. But back to the salt mines, man. Back to what we're doing. So as you heard, I kind of trying to spur the people on to get the word out on what we're trying to do here and what we are going to be doing here because it's important work. And I just want people to be clear. This isn't just you and I talking about stuff. This is going to be us out there doing stuff. And it's a big difference. And, I led them through kind of, what we've given them thus far with respect to your investigation, how you came to know Gacy, how you came to get involved with that case after the fact. And, now we're going to start digging into tonight what you started doing. So, and I know that you had wanted to add a couple of things about Michael Marino and Mrs. Marino that we had been discussing in the last episode, just to clarify some things, because I think you got some questions after the fact.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so go ahead. What do you got?
Yeah. Well, I'm very thankful for the input from the listeners. And I had a couple of questions after the last show. People had obvious questions, and I wanted to clear it up. It was about Michael Marino's DNA. When his body was tested, the DNA showed it wasn't related to Mrs. Marino. It was not her son. Okay.
Right.
But I thought I had explained it, but I want to make sure people understand. Kenny Parker, the other boy that disappeared on the same day, was identified on the same day. All right. Through the dental records. So I thought, oh, okay, maybe there's an honest mistake made and they accidentally switched the bodies. So I tried to locate the family of Kenneth Parker. I found out that both his mother and father were already deceased, so I couldn't go to them for answers. And I went to the sister who told me that, listen, they could never get his test his dental records because he had never gone to the dentist. So taking that information back to the attorneys, they got permission from the family. They didn't protest it at all. They exhumed the other body and tested and found out that it was not Michael's. So neither body was Michael's, right. Which means we have two other people. We don't know who they are.
Right. Okay. And just to explain to people again, and I know that I've brought it up, but again, remember in 1978, late 1978 and going into 1979, when they were unearthing all the bodies from Gacy's property and his crawl space in particular, they were limited in terms of how they could, try to identify the bodies. It was limited to basically medical records, dental records, and pieces of either jewelry or belts or some kind of identifying type of personal property that the victim may have been wearing, that they would be able to identify that person by what they had found in the shallow graves. So that's obviously limited, and there was situations where, when I interviewed the Cook County sheriff who was doing the digging, he talked about situations where there would be bodies stacked one on top of the other. So, when you're trying to put the skeletal remains together, the likelihood that you're mixing up bones is great, and so you're getting situations where exactly like with you've got with Parker and Marino, which interestingly, when I was doing the Gacy tapes and I was going through the police reports, in one of Gacy's 5 confessions, he talks about a double. Okay. Right. And that double was always assumed to have been Marino and Parker because they both went missing on the same day. So that was kind of how they did their police work. And remember, the medical examiner at that time was relying on what Gacy was saying just as much as anything else. So if Gacy was giving hints in anything that he was saying, which was all just handwritten by Mike Albrecht, remember, none of those confessions were recorded. So all that we ever got out of Gacy's confessions were Mike Albrecht's interpretation of what Gacy was saying that day in the station, over like 25, 26 hours when he gave those 5 confessions. So, it's not as if they could go back and listen to the taped interviews of Gacy because they didn't have it. Now, in my tapes, he talks about a lot of the same stuff. Had they known, or had my of course, my father wouldn't have given him access at that time because the case was getting litigated. So, my dad was preparing him for trial. But in my tapes, I have a lot of the same information because, frankly, my father's going through all of his statements with Gacy. That's really what he's doing in those tapes in order to try to prepare him for his insanity defense. So, the point being, there could be, and I don't want to upset anybody, but there could be many of the victims that have been misidentified. Just frankly, if we've got dental comparisons, in courts of law, bite mark comparisons are no longer admissible or in terms of being usable as reliable scientific evidence. I think that they can they can get them in, but it just goes to the weight. Like, you can't have the expert say, okay, well, I can say with a reasonable degree of medical certainty that this victim is that victim based on my analysis of the bite marks. But it's kind of the same thing with just dental records in general. I mean, yeah, I mean, unless they're in teeth are definitely individualistic, meaning that most of us, our teeth look different. So I think that some of them, if there were certain things that were done, or there were certain fillings that were put in on certain teeth, maybe that's pretty reliable. But in terms of broken bones, or in terms of, they find a belt buckle that was in one of the shallow graves, but if there were multiple victims in there, my point being that probably at some point, and whether or not the families would even be interested in doing it, they should probably go back and DNA test all of them, to be honest with you, just to make sure that we know who's who. I mean, because it's always just been assumed that they've been identified correctly. And the first person that reaches out to you, you end up finding out that they had misidentified that one. So it's a 1 out of 1 in terms of misidentification, in terms of victims that have been reinvestigated, which is a pretty high number. So I mean, it's something that I think that we'll probably look into. I imagine, Bill, as we're kind of working through this thing, that we'll probably have like families of the victims reaching out to us and saying, hey, we've always kind of had questions about this. Would you be willing to look at this? And, I mean, at this point, we're not going to be turning anybody away. I mean, we're going to listen to anybody that has anything to say, especially if their son was a victim or purported to be a victim of Gacy. So I think we owe it to them to do that. So, why don't we start getting into, we left off kind of with you having the meetings with various people, you getting the distinct feeling that Chicago had no interest and Cook County had no interest in really getting into this. You got the distinct feeling that they were trying to figure out what you knew and they were really just trying to extract information from you in order for them to try to shut it down, to quiet you, to get this thing put out, so to speak, in terms of a little fire getting started. They didn't want it all coming out for many, many reasons.
Right, for sure.
And, but that didn't stop you. As a matter of fact, I think that spurred you on even more because you're a searcher of the truth. You're a victim's advocate. You want people to know what is going on in their families' lives. And if they have a missing son, you're built like that. You're going to do everything in your power to try to help them. So why don't you start telling us, so what did you start doing after the sham dig and after the second sham dig?
Yeah. Well, the first dig in 98 was actually done by the Chicago Police Department. It was under their direction. When I had taken the information to the police about that incident with Gacy with the shovel, I merely told them, go talk to people who live in the building and the building owner. And I suspected they would do that. After Gacy got arrested and years that followed, I learned that they didn't ever talk to people in the building. Leading up to the 1998 first search, when I had that first meeting with the Chicago Police Department, I did mention that they should talk to Lynn and Bruno Musinski because they lived in the basement of that apartment, and I had visited with them many times, and I was certain that they surely had information about it. And I knew that because my wife, even after we had moved, she was in communication with Lynn Musinski, and Lynn was telling her about the activities of Gacy. And so she related to me. Now, I did not want to be the one that went to Lynn Musinski and Bruno Musinski to ask them questions. I gave the information to Chicago police. Cook County had it then, but in the 98 dig, it was only Chicago police. I wanted them to do the interview. I mean, Rutherford and Dickinson, two detectives who I knew, are experienced detectives. They know how to run an investigation. And like me, you don't want your witness telling you anything but what they know to be true. You don't want them to talk to Bill Dorsch first, because I might be putting in information that they really didn't know about before. But now when they talk to Dickinson and Rutherford, that information is not really theirs. They got it from me. I want only what they know. So I stayed out of it. And in the search warrant, I know they talked to Lynn and Bruno, and they didn't want to know anything except when they lived in the building. They also went, because at that first meeting, I told them maybe you should go across the street and talk to the Ignaffo family, because they live right across the street. And I know they knew the Lynn and Bruno also. And they did interview John Ignaffo and the son. And so now after 1998, the fake dig, coming back to 2011, where interest is there again, I decided to go out and interview these people for the very first time. So from 1978, when he got arrested, till 20 years later, I had never talked to any of the people that lived in the building. But I started with Lynn and Bruno, and I knew both of them from childhood. We went to the same school, lived in the same neighborhood. We knew everything about each other. I knew they married and they were living in that basement apartment. So Bruno and Lynn were divorced now at that time in 98. So when I met with Lynn in 98, well, first I called and said, hey, the police are going to want to talk to you about the building and when you lived there. And I alerted her to that. And then later we talked, and she said, well, yeah, they talked to me, but they didn't want any information. So I said, okay, now tell me what you know. And this is the first time she's telling me. And she says, well, we moved into that apartment building, and after a few years that we were there, John Gacy became the maintenance man. And, she described him, she described his mannerisms, and she said, there was something about him, I was never really comfortable, but he would sometimes visit, have a cup of coffee in our apartment when he was there. And he always had young boys with him. Okay. And she says, but of course, he was a strange man and he did strange things. He didn't live there, but he worked there. She says there were several times early in the morning, like 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, when her and Bruno, who lived in the basement apartment, which was adjacent to the common laundry area that everybody used, that they would be awakened by the laundry door hitting the wall, which separated their apartment from that area. All right. And it would wake them up. And Bruno would get out of bed and he'd look out the window and he'd either see John outside or see his vehicle outside. So he never went further to investigate, but just said to Lynn, it's just John. And they let it go. But she said the things that she wanted to tell the police, they had no interest in it. She said, I offered to meet with the police at the Miami Avenue apartments. She says, I'll show you where you should dig. And she described to me the things that she has seen. She says he would, during the daytime, he would be there with boys and they would do digging. And she said they always dug big holes and they were random. She said they weren't really, she said she questioned it because her and the other people in the building saw that these were bigger holes than needed to plant a bush or a flower. But the holes would also be left open for several days. And that fence wasn't there in the time that Gacy worked there. Okay. Right. But her apartment was on this end of the building towards Elston Avenue. Okay. And the laundry area was on the other side. So they had view of the front yard, and she was specific in telling me areas where the police should look. But like I said, they had no interest in doing that. I also went then to talk to Bruno, and Bruno also, he said, Bill, I'm a cop like you. He says, we've been friends all our lives. We worked in the same district together. When Gacy got arrested, we said, wow, but all of a sudden now we're relating to things that we have seen him do, and we're suspicious about the acts that I called. He says, I called the Chicago Police Department to say, hey, I lived in a building on Miami Avenue. Gacy was a maintenance man. you got to go over there and look at it, because not only us, but other people in the building believe that bodies could be buried here. And he was told, Bruno, we don't want any bodies. Same thing I had been told. Okay, but I was told that by the sheriff's department. Anyway, he went into detail again, like his wife did, about the occurrences with Gacy, the mysterious digging, so forth and so on, in the property. Now, and then the police did go to talk to John Ignafo, and they put that information in their first search warrant. And John's apartment across the street had a total view of the front lawn area, and it wasn't fenced, and the front and one side of the building along Elston Avenue. But
yeah, and just so people know, Bill, this is the property that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So the fence that Bill's talking about, that did not exist at the time. That was built later.
Right.
This is clearly one of the sham digs that they did. You can see they did some looks like they did some, I guess you'd call it grid work there in terms of, but like obviously none of that got, none of that was dug up.
Right. And but John said that he said he recalled vividly a couple of occurrences where him and his wife would be up early in the morning hours, again 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, because their son John Jr. had an asthma problem, and so they would sit up with their son, hoping he would feel better, and they would sit at their dining room table, smoking cigarettes and looking out the window. They could see the property. And he said several times, or one time in particular, he looked out the window and he says, I didn't know the name of the man who worked there, but I recognized it was the guy that worked there at the property. And he says, I saw him walking across the lawn carrying large bags over his shoulder. And he would walk over to an area where I saw him digging. And I said, you saw him digging? I says, was he digging the hole or was he filling in a hole? He says, well, I really can't tell. Although I could really tell you, all I can tell you is I know it was a shovel, and his actions were like, I thought he was digging a hole, but maybe he was covering up the hole. I don't know. But I definitely saw him with these large bags, and whatever he had went into that hole. Okay. More suspicious activity. But then again, the police department didn't want that information. They never did interview Bruno, So until I'm the only one, I'm the one that did the interview.
It's crazy to me that they didn't.
Right. So now in 2011, now we're going on. The first dig is over. I had only told them go talk to Lynn and Bruno and go talk to the Ignafos. They did not talk to his wife, Pat. She had died in the meantime. I mean, after 98. And they didn't talk to John Jr., his son. But in 2011, when the interest is gaining again, I decided to reach out to John Jr. and ask him what he knew about the property, because I knew from Lynn, from Lynn and from John, that his son often went to the house on Miami Avenue to visit with Lynn. All right. And John was just a young boy at the time. So I contacted John, and he was very helpful. He said, well, Mr. Dorsch, he says, at the time I might have been 8, 9 years old. And I would cross the street with my mom, go to the apartment so she could talk with Lynn. And I would often go across the street to play with other kids that lived in the area there. And we would play on that very front lawn that didn't have the fence at that time. And he said we would play football or throw a ball around because it was bigger than the other front yards. He says, but also, he says, there were large holes dug in the front yard. And he says, I remember playing in those holes. And I said, what do you mean playing in the holes, John? He says, well, we were young kids and we would play war games. He says, so when we would chase each other around, pretend to be fighting in a war, we would jump in a hole like we'd seen in the movies, and we would pretend to be shooting at each other from these holes. And I said, well, John, how big were the holes? And he said, well, you could get 2 or 3 kids into a hole. Okay. And I said, wow. And they said, it wasn't until years later, after Gacy was arrested, that I had more experience in life. He says, I had been to funerals and I had been to the burial sites. And I realized now that the types of holes that we were playing in that front yard were like graves. They were the size of graves. And he says, I would like to help, and I'll tell the police what I know, and so forth. And then I also thought, okay, John Ignafo and his son, they gave me this information. One of the things as a detective in homicides that we all do is we do canvasses, meaning when a crime happens in an area, in a building, we go to other occupants in the building. We go to the neighbors' houses. We want to connect with people in chance that they had some information that was valuable to our investigation. So I found out that the Chicago Police and Cook County Sheriffs, they never did do a canvass. They never had gone to that building. So how could they? All right. So I started. I went across the street to the Nelson family. They lived on the other side of the alley from where my parking area was from my apartment. And I knew that family very well, very well. And they had several boys. Well, when I went to talk to the Nelsons, the parents, they had already moved to the suburbs. And they were telling me, that, yeah, we got some pictures back from that time. We'll look for the pictures and they'll give you an idea what the property looked like. And I have those photos. But they also told me something. You should go talk to my son, Michael, because Michael, he actually worked at the Miami apartments. I says, what? I didn't know this. He says, yeah, well, he used to cut the grass there and shovel the snow, and he got paid by Gacy. All right. And I said, wow. So I got in touch with Michael, and he was very helpful also. And he said, well, Mr. Dorsch, he says, I started cutting grass at a young kid, maybe 10, 11 years old, and I had acquired a client list already. And one day I got approached by this guy from the Miami apartments who walked over to me and said, hey, listen, I need some help. Would you be interested in cutting the lawn, shoveling the snow, and taking out the garbage from the rear of these apartment buildings? He says, well, sure, it's right across the street, no problem. He says, so he started doing that at that property. And he says, the fence wasn't there, like I said, but he said along the sidewalk, along Miami Avenue and along Elston Avenue and several other locations on the property, he recalled that when he was cutting the grass, he would have to be very careful because there were holes, open holes, the size of graves that were left open in the lawn, and he'd have to cut around them with the lawnmower. And he explained to me and showed me the pattern of where Gacy told him, that he had done some grass work, and the grass might be a little bit higher in other places, but be careful when you cut over here. And he said he showed me the area along the sidewalk, and that's, if he was burying the bodies along the sidewalk on Elson and Miami Avenue, that's the same thing he was doing in his home. He was following the foundation walls.
Yeah. So
it was easier for Gacy in his mind to keep track of where a body might be buried and where the next one could be buried, so that was important to know. And so I gave that information in 2011 to several people, and I gave it to the sheriff's department when I met with them. Matter of fact, you've met with these people, Bob. You've met with these witnesses.
I have.
And you've gotten the same information as I have. But what I did when I went to that meeting with the sheriff's department that came after the first one was, I told you about their inquiry. They asked me to meet with them and they turned it down. And then it was followed up much later with a phone call. But I brought an attorney with me to that meeting. And at that meeting, I told them about my witnesses, gave them their contact information, and I gave them the audio videotapes of the interviews I did with each of these people. I said, you need to talk to these people. They have information that you may want to know about. Well, it took a year or a little over a year before they actually did go and meet with them. That's how interested they were. And I was there. I arranged for the witnesses to meet with them at the Miami Avenue address. Bruno Musinski was out of town and Lynn was out of town, but they did interview Mike Nelson and John Ignafo. And maybe Lynn was there too. I'm not sure now. But they met with them, and the witnesses didn't walk on the property, but there was a fence there now, and they were explaining as they walked what areas they should look. Okay. And so that's the best they did with those witnesses. And we know that when they did do the second dig, that was the Cook County Sheriff that did that with the accompaniment of the FBI, which I will get into later. They did a secretive dig. They did it in March on a very cold day, according to the weather reports. They did it late in the afternoon, and they told no one about their intention of being there that day and doing the search. But days later, they announced that they had done this search and they had found nothing. Okay. And so that's where that 5 witnesses come into play. Oh, interestingly, this is also another witness that lived behind me in a house there, the Amato family. I had asked them to keep their eye on the property prior to the dig because I wanted to know what was going on. And she had called me one day and said, "Hey, I think they're getting ready to dig." So I ran over to her house to find out what she knew. And as I'm sitting there with her, she's explaining to me an incident that happened. She says, I was in my house one day, and she says, I looked out and I could see all the way through the alley, all the way to the Miami Avenue building from where my yard is. And she says, I saw my son and one of the Nelson boys were stopped next to a man in a car. And they were talking to the man in the car. And she says, I don't know what this is about. So she went outside and she approached the boys and the man in the car. And she says, what's going on? And he says, oh, ma'am, nothing, no problem. I work over here at the Miami Avenue building. I take care of the property there. I saw the boys. I wanted to offer them a job. I need them to pass out flyers about my business and the work I do. And she says, oh, they're a little too young. They don't need a job. And she says, that was John Gacy that was trying to lure my boy and the Nelson boy to go with him. And so this guy was always on the prowl.
Always.
He didn't stop day or night. But it got difficult for him because the business, like Dean Carell, he had businesses to run. It took a lot of their time. And like Gacy got his ass whipped a couple times by some of the kids he tried to pick up. Right. And so he found through Dean Carell that, hey, why don't you have other boys bring boys to you? And then he started doing the same thing, Yep. And so,
all right. So we got a few questions. So Brent Tipton, what year did you see Gacy with the shovel? I think you said it was 74, sometime 74.
Well, it was after I met him in 74. In January, February, because the snow was on the ground. I said my son wasn't born to April. He came to my house a couple months after that to do the repair work in the bathroom. And it was after that when I was still living there. It would had to be late 74 or 75.
Right. And just so people understand, the reason why. So Tim McCoy was Gacy's alleged first victim. And I say that because that's what they've attributed as his first victim that they found. But Gacy admitted to in his confessions, and that was the only kid that he had used a weapon with. He had gotten into a knife fight with this young man. And he claimed that when he woke up that McCoy was standing above him with the knife and he wrestled the knife away from him and then he stabbed him, and that he was the first first victim he had dumped in the crawl space. And then at some point thereafter, shortly thereafter, Carol moves into the property. So Carol, her mother, Carol's two daughters, and John's mom were all living there at one point. So he had a ton of women in that house, women and kids, and he was not in any position at that point to be burying anybody in his house. So we know that Tim McCoy went missing in 72, and we know that Tim McCoy ended up being killed by Gacy in 72. And, from that point forward, he's got Carol and all the other people in the house up until he divorces her, which is late 75. So all that time, he is working as a maintenance man at that building that I had up, which is Miami and Elston. So they had always assumed that Gacy had gone dormant after he kills McCoy, and that he's not going to kill, that he doesn't kill anybody else up until Johnny Bukovich. What do you got?
And even before McCoy, Gacy got out of prison, but he was on parole. Okay. Before McCoy, he had 2 arrests in the northern suburbs for soliciting young boys. So he was actively out on the prowl already.
Yep.
Okay. And the one thing that people learn in prison is mistakes. And for John Gacy, he learned, he got out of jail, he went to prison, then he got arrested twice. What's he learning? His mistake is he's allowing his victims to live. That's his mistake. They can put a finger on him, but dead bodies don't talk. And so he definitely was active before McCoy, and he was active forever after that. He didn't stop.
For sure, which is kind of like our thing. There's no part of me that thinks that Gacy stopped from 72 until Bukovich. There's no chance of it that he was
right. And you and I have locations.
Yes,
okay?
we do.
We have locations where we have been put in touch with people who say, hey, Gacy was working here. He did this, and we're very suspicious of this. Or I had lived there at the time. I don't live there anymore, but you should go back over there and check these places out. Right. Now, we know about it, but the sheriff's department doesn't know about it.
Right.
And so we're going to do it.
Right. Well, we're doing it. I mean, they didn't investigate that. That's like the whole thing.
Right.
Everything that you see going on with the Huerman case, like the Gilgo Beach Lisk case, in terms of further investigation, trying to figure out if this guy has more victims, trying to find the evidence to attach the other Lisk victims to him. None of that occurred with Gacy, none of it. And as far as I know, Bill, one reporter, and I didn't want to get a copyright claim, but I pulled up Jay Levine's report, because he was the only guy out of everything that I researched when I was doing the Gacy season, the only reporter that had any story relating to the fact that Gacy had enough interactions with the law in terms of prior to John Bukovich that they should have known. If they would have done any modicum of investigation in terms of what he was doing at that time, that they could have stopped him, they should have stopped him. But beyond stopping him at the time, in terms of investigation that took place after he's arrested, after they know for a fact that the man's a monster, that the man had killed 30 plus people, they did zero investigation into anything else that he may have done other than the victims that they uncovered from the house. So they completely ignored this 3-year gap in time when Carol's living in the house, when he has access to Miami and Elston, when he has access to every other place that he was doing contractors work, where he's the only guy in there, where he's able to dig holes, where he's able to lay concrete, all the signature moves of Gacy that he had at his disposal, where he could go visit his sites late at night and dispose of bodies. None of that was investigated. None of it. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're looking into. So, it's to me, it's like, I mean, you know how much it bothered me. You could hear it in terms of when I was doing the podcast, man. It blew my
Right.
mind, because that was obviously something that was never covered in the dozens and dozens of documentaries, or Terry Sullivan's book, or Sam Emiranti's book, or Russ Ewing's book. They didn't talk about that stuff.
None.
So
Not
they
at
all
all.
talk about the same stuff.
None.
The same thing that they all talk about. So Mae Brussel had asked, would there be sinkholes? I'm assuming she's talking about at Miami and Elston.
Well, there can. I mean, the soil could deteriorate or change over time. All right. But what you and I have done, we've got more recent information about the property.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And of course, like Ron LaBarca had said, who did the first scan for us and then with the police department, you don't know for sure what's buried or if anything's buried there until you actually do dig into that anomaly.
Right.
But that's what police work is about. I mean, police will dig holes looking for bodies in other cases, and who can fault them if the body isn't there? I mean, there's due diligence. They're doing their job. All right. And we expected an honest and thorough investigation, but that was never done. They never went to the employee list to talk to the kids to find out if these employees were still alive. And we know that Butkovich and Zink and several other kids that work for Gacy turned out to be his victims. Okay. I want to show you, this is another witness. So we're going to talk about this later. She and others, she sent me this, and I want to see if you can see it all right. It's on my wall. It's a little tough to see. Oh boy. Right behind me over here, you see a couple shovels. And there's a street pole there, and it says Miami and Elston. All right. It says boots on the ground, which is something I know you've said often.
Yep.
And on the bottom of it says, can you dig it? All
which
right.
I also say a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will tell you that this person and others have a direct connection to one of Gacy's victims. And they offered that information to Chicago police and to the Cook County Sheriff's Department, and they did nothing about it.
All right. And that leads me right into this question, which a couple people have asked. So Michelle Burns and Travis Williamson echoed it. Why would the police not have an interest in the information? Like why, Bill? Why don't the cops care?
Well, there's several. It's not the cops. It's the people that run things. Okay. Things start with the mayor. I mean, of course, the mayor selects a police chief. Okay. He's not responsible, the mayor, for going out and doing investigations. All right. He trusted his police department under the commander that they have will do thorough investigative work, especially in the case of this note where it's so massive and in the news every day in the news. They wanted to rush this case. They wanted to rush the Gacy case into a courtroom and get it behind them. All right. It took less than, I think it was 16 or 17 months from arrest to trial, a trial where we have 33 victims. Most cases in Chicago where you have a single murder, that case doesn't hit the courtroom for a trial until maybe 2 years later or more.
It was shorter than that. He was arrested in December of 78.
Yeah.
He went to trial in March of
yes.
Yeah.
March of 80.
So
I mean, and a lot of those bodies weren't even identified.
Right.
All right. And so they didn't, that starts there. Now there's an embarrassment with the city, with the people at the top. The police are doing their job, but the city's embarrassed. The reputation is bad. This is Chicago's a murder capital, you know. Tourists come to Chicago. They don't need this kind of reputation. All right. So there was also the fact that when the kids were reported missing, all they did was take a one-page report. You know, they fill out the boxes and then maybe they put a little narrative on the backside and they put that into the police mail. It goes to the youth division. It gets assigned to a youth officer. And he calls up the families of the missing kid and say, is Johnny home yet? And they say, no, yeah, he's home. Okay, good. Johnny's not home. Well, call me when he comes home.
Right.
Okay. But knowing what I know about the police department, the youth officers were overwhelmed with other work, and they also get these missing kids put into their mailbox. You're assigned to this missing case. They're not running out to the houses. They're not going out to the houses to talk to the families. They're really doing it on a telephone. And they're not out there in the field doing actual work. Well, there's one case, though. One of the 33 missings handled totally different. And, oh, God. I'm trying to think of the name right now. His father was a police sergeant on the Chicago Police Department. All right.
Right.
So when his son went missing, he looked himself, didn't find him, but then he made the proper reports out to the youth division, and I've got all the reports. Instead of one youth officer doing a telephone call, we've got the youth division spending weeks with maybe 10 different youth officers going out in the field looking for the sergeant's son and submitting reports. Not done in any other case. And I'll tell you, as I'm a Chicago Police Department member at that time, if my son had been missing, I would think that I could get this extra investigative work being done. I would hope I could.
Right.
All right. But that was the only case where there was real investigative work. But yet they didn't do all the work that could have been done. They never contacted the missing kid who was later identified as a Gacy victim. They never went out and talked to his girlfriend at the time. I did. They should have had the information about the girlfriend, because they told the police when he went missing, the sergeant told the police that he had gone out to buy a card to mail to her at college for her birthday. Okay. Well, many years later, I'm getting this information, but I found her. And I inquired, I said, did you ever get that card? Because I thought it might be important, as a timeline thing. And also, I was thinking, there's instances in other missing cases where Gacy had someone make a phone call. Oh, your son he told me he was going to go to Puerto Rico, stuff like that.
Right.
And so I thought it's very possible that this kid went out, got the card, and met up with Gacy and was killed. But maybe the kid didn't write the card or mail the card, but maybe there's DNA on that card, or maybe the signature's not the kid's,
Right.
So I asked the girl about that, and I asked her, she says, I still may have that card. Well, unfortunately, she did check. And when I called her back, she told me she couldn't find the card. But at the time of the kid going missing, and suspicion about Gacy already, and this kid only lived like a half a mile from Gacy. All right. And the girl told me in the interview I had with her, because I asked her, I said, do you know how he could have contacted with Gacy? She says, well, I do know one time when we were walking down the street, and she didn't know the street, but it was close to where they lived. And her boyfriend said, he pointed to a house across the street. Oh, that guy over there hires young kids to do carpentry work. I'm going to try to get work with him. Okay. But they didn't talk to her. And you don't ask questions, you don't get answers. But the relevance is very important. It's the timeline. If you're talking to people close to the time of the crime, the chances are that you're going to recover information that can be followed up that's pertinent to your investigation. When months go by and years go by and decades go by, like in my case, I'm trying to get information from people and ask them to recall incidents that happened 20 some years ago, 30 years ago. But if the police had followed up on their stuff, like in this one case I'm talking about with the young lady that sent me this little flyer back here, not a flyer, it's a beautiful portrait. They had direct knowledge that their knowledge of the case, and it's not her, there's several other people that had knowledge of the union between the missing and Mike Rossi.
Right.
And Mike Rossi is one of the people that John Gacy said was directly involved.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that Gacy asked when he was taken into custody was who else did they arrest?
Mm-hmm.
Because he said there were others involved.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when they pressed him on that, he kind of retracted it. But, again, like I interviewed Mike Albrecht a couple of times for the podcast, and Mike was the one who was literally the one doing the questioning during this interrogation. Now, you have to understand this wasn't, some 6-month long, sitting on Gacy, investigating Gacy, trailing him. This was 10 days. And the arrest happened suddenly. And I uncovered why they arrested him at that certain time, why it happened so quickly. And, what they ended up uncovering as a result of that second warrant that they were able to get, but Mike went in there and he was very candid. He's like, I didn't have a list of questions. He's like, frankly, I didn't have to ask Gacy anything. He just started popping off. He just started running off at the mouth when I had him. He's like, we were all in this little teeny interrogation room. There were like 8 of us in there, crammed in there because everyone wanted to hear it. And Gacy just starts puking all this stuff up. And, beyond any kind of investigation that took place, again, relating to the victims that were found on his property, did not exist. Like Mike didn't ask any of those questions. Desplaines lost control of the investigation as the Cook County Sheriff's Police took it over. Kunkel and his guys took it over, and his Cook County Sheriff investigator was the lead dude on it. And they just weren't digging into that, and I asked Bill about that, and Bill Kunkel was very candid with me, because I said, look, Bill, Gacy was very clear about the fact that he kept incredibly detailed records of everywhere that he traveled. And if you don't know anything about Gacy was a contractor, and Gacy did jobs all over the place, not just in Chicago, not just pharmacies. He traveled to Wisconsin. He traveled to Kansas City. He traveled to Michigan. He traveled to Minnesota. He traveled all over the place. That's what the guy did. He did work everywhere. And, none of it was ever looked into at all. You're basically taking this guy's business records, every hotel that he stayed at. You're just doing the police work, and none of it ever got done. And at that point, Kunkel's like, yeah, he's telling his investigator, yeah, kind of look into it, cross-check it. Gacy's saying that, because there's this famous thing that I have from my tapes where Gacy says, Sam says I could have done it to 100 kids. I could have killed 100 kids. He's like, I don't know, maybe I did, and he's like, I can't remember, he's saying those kind of things. And, when you have these kind of records where we could pinpoint where Gacy was at certain times, and we're going and checking NamUs, and I could say, okay, this kid went missing the same day that Gacy was in town, or around the same day that Gacy was in town. At that point, we've got a lead. You know what I'm saying? And then that goes for every single place that Gacy went, because when I started the podcast, much like the same kind of contact that you had when people started hearing what you were digging into, that you had people contacting you saying, hey, Bill, I'd really like you to look into my kid that's gone missing. I had the same thing going on with the podcast. I had people reaching out to me, hey, my loved one went missing, and, I'd really like you to dig into it. And I said, well, you're in luck. I've got a friend that's going to be doing this with me. And that's the stuff that we're going to be doing. So, again, anybody out there that may know anybody that has a loved one that has gone missing, and yes, it's been 40 plus years, but I don't care if it's been 100 years. Every single victim deserves to have their name back.
Certainly.
Every single family member has the right to have closure and find out what happened to their loved one. And we're going to see to it that if we're going to do everything in our power to see if that's the case,
Yeah. And I want to go back to the reasons again why the city didn't do it. First off, there was the embarrassment by the city of their reputation. Secondly, the police department was very embarrassed and accused and actually sued for malfeasance and not doing a proper job in investigating the loss of the missing kids. Right. But also there was a relationship that I uncovered when I interviewed Joe Kozenzak for the very first time, and where he said that the woman that came into the police department inquiring about Michael Rossi, who she said was their son, and threatened them, telling them, you're not going to have a job tomorrow if you don't let him go. And they asked why. And she said, because my son is a grandson of Vito Marzullo. Well, Vito Marzullo was the second most powerful politician in the city of Chicago at that time. And suddenly, Michael Marino went from being a suspect, accomplice of John Gacy, to being used as a witness against Gacy in the trial.
No question.
And he got a very powerful attorney by the name of Hanrahan, who had been the state's attorney for Cook County just prior to that, to represent him, to make sure that little Michael didn't get charged in this case.
Yeah, for sure.
And so those are the reasons why that wasn't done. But with I don't know if we have time for today to go into this, but that information came from Kozenczak, and I haven't gone into the details about the interviews that I did. And I did 3 interviews with him, and then with Terry Sullivan, who I wanted to talk to also, because he was not only a prosecutor, but like Kozenczak, they both had written books about Gacy.
Right.
Okay. And my book, I want people to know this. They put it in their own words. They explain my belief about this case in their own words. They did nothing. And the reason, you go to the appendix of my book and you'll find answers to my FOIAs, where the sheriff's department says, we did not do an investigation because we were not the primary. We were there only to assist Desplaines.
Right.
That's not true.
Right.
They had that case. They were in charge.
Right.
And then they go on to say, well, we didn't collect any written reports. When I asked for, when I FOIA'd and asked for all the reports on their investigation, we don't have it, because all the information we had from other agencies was verbal. We didn't write any reports. What the hell kind of police department do you have with a major investigation, with 33 kids, preparing it for trial against a man in court, and you don't even have written documentation of the interviews that you've done, the work that you've done, and what you found? You know, it starts at the top in that organization at that time. Of course, in the city of Chicago, the responsibility for that stuff and the cover up for that stuff just flows down to the next person.
Right. So, yeah. I mean, like, if you look as late as 78 with like the Rignall thing, like, and if people don't know the Jeff Rignall story, it's like March of 78, you know, Gacy gets arrested in December, you know, he's getting sloppy at that point in terms of kind of his MO, you know, but like, if the Jeff Rignall thing happened today, in today's day and age, where Jeff Rignall is picked up off the street and then is taken to Gacy's garage and is absolutely tortured and sexually assaulted for 2 days. And, you know, like and Gacy doesn't kill him, like Gacy, like, lets him go, you know? So like his little lesson that you claim that he learned in prison, he didn't apply. And he did that with a lot of kids, you know, it wasn't just Rignall.
But the one thing he's got now, in his mind, he's got power. He's got connections to people and places.
Exactly. Okay. And he knows that Chicago PD is indifferent.
Right.
He knows that. Like he's had so many brushes that, you know, so they end up charging him with, I think, a misdemeanor battery.
Right.
It was the charge against Gacy for the Rignall thing, which that case was still pending when Gacy got arrested. Like, I need you to understand, he grabs Rignall off the street, he kidnaps him, keeps him just absolutely strapped to this torture board he had in his garage for 2 days, kept chloroforming him to sleep. Like, when you see Rignall's face, his entire face was burnt.
Terrible.
Because Gacy kept, every time he'd come to, he'd put him back out. Rignall absolutely claims that there was a second participant that he saw. You know, he saw him one of the times he came back, you know, to consciousness, and like, that's what he's charged with. Like, today's day and age, like they would have like absolutely buried him with like multiple felony charges. Back then, it was nothing. Which goes to what you're saying. Like, Gacy knew he didn't have to worry about it. It wasn't like something that he concerned himself with, because number one, of his connections, and number two, he knew that Chicago police was just indifferent to everything that was going on in the gay community. If it involved gay guys, It was a gay fight. We don't care. It's like a gay problem. We just don't care, and that was factual. That was the mindset of the Chicago police back then, and as soon as but ironically, that got a bunch of coverage from the press, the Rignall thing. Like, unlike many of his other victims that had escaped, like, those didn't get the press coverage. This one did. And when it did, people started coming out of the woodwork. Other people that had survived Gacy, like the amount of surviving Gacy victims, I call them, is unbelievable. Like, when I started the pod, and I'm trying to vet people, as we're going along, I'm trying to, for some like sometimes people want to inject themselves into cases like this for reasons unknown. I don't know why they'd want to do that, but they do, so Darren and I would be sitting there and we'd look at the timeline and we'd ask a series of questions. And then if the timeline didn't work, we'd be like, all right, well, thanks for calling us. But we knew that it didn't fit. It didn't fit because either Gacy had been arrested at that point. There was something wrong with their story or their version of the story where we knew it wasn't legitimate. But again, if there's anybody out there, and no matter how long ago it was, if you've got a family member that's still missing, that was anywhere in the Midwest, frankly, is on our radar, that went missing during the period of time that was Gacy's active period, which 72 to 78 that we know about. I happen to believe that it was before that. Like, Bill and my father both think that Gacy became a killer in prison. I think that he may have killed his first in Iowa. Bill, I can't argue with your theory, your premise on it, that's when he wised up and like, all right, well, clearly my mistake was leaving my victims alive. Like, I'm going to get rid of that problem moving forward. I'm not going to do that again. That makes sense.
I didn't tell you this, but I do have a connection to another kid from Iowa that came to me recently.
All right.
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So I'm going to let you go to bed, man. It's 4 a.m. there at this point.
Oh yeah. It's after 4. It's like it's put my glasses on here. I can't see my screen. It's 4:07, I think. 4:07.
What a guy. What a champion. Like, just so you guys know how dedicated Bill Dorsch is, if that's not proof positive, I don't know what is. If any of my mods would be kind enough to put the link to Bill's book, throw that thing up there. You got it, Bill.
I got to grab it here.
If you could throw that up in the chat, I'd appreciate it, y'all. The thing's unbelievable.
And again, in the back of this book, pay attention to those what's in the appendix. Through their own words, they did nothing.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. And there's so much in this book that Bob and I haven't talked about, or we probably won't talk about. There's too much to tell. But if you don't ask questions, you don't get answers. And I want to give you the answers.
100%. That's what we're doing, man. That's why we're doing this. And all right, so we'll keep churning on in our next episode. We'll keep digging in and seeing what you figured out as we're moving along. And ultimately, when we get to the kind of the end of your investigation and kind of picking up where you and I start, that's when we're boots on the ground, man. But like, we got to get the people there to let them know that we're not just spinning our wheels here, that there's a basis for all this, that we have reasons that we're out here doing all these things, and why we're going to be out there boots on the ground, sticking shovels into the ground, talking to people, investigating. We're going to be doing it, man. So, and I'm so grateful that I'm doing it with you, man. And I'm excited about the prospects of being able to give families closure and victims their names back, because I'm pretty confident, Bill, that we're going to help some people out with this thing. So, Jennifer Johnson, thank you so much for that super sticker. We appreciate the support. We really, really do. And my friend, you're the best. Take care.
Good night, sir. We'll talk to you during the week.
Yep. All right. Take care, Bill.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye. All right. So there he is. You got to love Bill. Bill's the best in the business. Bill is just true advocate. He's just a guy that never gives up. The man's, I believe he's 82 years old. And that's amazing to me. That is dedication. He could be sitting around over in Europe relaxing, not worrying about this stuff anymore, but he chooses to still dedicate his life and his work to this. And ultimately, we hope that we're going to be able to help people, and we need your all support. So, keep spreading the word. Like I said, we want this thing out there. Like the people that are in here now and that are following this with us, you're going to be on the front lines with us. And everybody's going to be catching up, and you guys are going to be the ones that know what's up. So pat yourselves on the back for being smart enough to be involved with this, because this isn't just a couple of guys talking about true crime. We're a couple of guys that are going to be out there, boots on the ground, getting it done. So again, thank you all for joining us. I hope you found it informative. I hope you found it interesting. And, like always, we're giving you just facts. Thanks for joining us, because without you, I'd just be an old man talking about an old case. Talk to you next time.